If one day I should leave you, I wouldn't leave a single word behind, because everything I wanted to say would have already been spoken through a lifetime of loving you. I had never seen a snowstorm so massive and unrelenting. Snowflakes danced wildly across the sky, carried by a howling gale, leaving nothing but an endless expanse of white in every direction. We were on the southern slopes of the Himalayas, at an elevation of over 16,000 feet. More than 4 hours earlier, we had been caught in this sudden blizzard during our descent. To make matters worse, the girl traveling with me, Avery, had slipped on a downward slope and injured her foot. The guide carried her on his back to a leeward spot where a few tall, jutting rocks formed a small, natural shelter against the wind. The three of us sat on the ground, as silent as the towering mountains around us. Avery was the first to speak. She said softly to leave her behind and hurry down the mountain. I glared at her, telling her to stop talking nonsense. Deep down, I knew she didn't just say it casually. To utter those words in the face of life and death meant she had gone through a fierce internal struggle. But I couldn't bring myself to abandon her, even though we had only known each other for a month. Ultimately, the guide made the call, telling Avery and me to stay put and wait while he headed down alone to find a rescue team. I had no idea how long we would have to wait. The wait felt endlessly long, so quiet that I could almost hear the ticking of the seconds slipping by. I was worried about Avery's foot. Her ankle was severely swollen, and blood had already pooled beneath the skin. Neither of us had brought any topical ointment for the swelling, and if the injury got infected, the consequences would be unthinkable. Total darkness fell, and the snow outside still showed no signs of stopping. We layered on every piece of clothing we had, huddled into our down sleeping bags, and each managed to eat a few crackers and a piece of chocolate. We slowly thawed our frozen water with our body heat before drinking it down. I still don't know how we managed to survive that night. When the morning light finally seeped through the cracks in the rocks, I opened my eyes and let out a heavy sigh of relief. I gave Avery a gentle nudge, and she let out a soft groan. Looking at her pale face, I reached out to touch her forehead and my heart skipped a beat. She was running a fever. After taking some fever-reducing medicine, she curled back up and fell asleep. When she woke up around noon, she seemed to be doing a bit better. We each ate an energy bar and leaned against the rock wall, chatting. The snow was still falling outside. During that seemingly endless wait, there was nothing else to do but talk. However, as time went on, it became increasingly difficult for her to even speak, and a fine layer of sweat broke out on her forehead. Worried, I told her to stop talking and save her strength. She glanced out through the gap in the rocks and murmured that it was getting dark again. She asked me if I thought we would live to see tomorrow's sunrise. A chill ran through me as I told her to stop talking crazy. She fell silent for a moment before suddenly bringing up a question I had asked her in the past, about why she was always wandering out here all alone. I remembered it well. We were drinking together in a small tavern in Pokhara, Nepal. She had told me she had been traveling alone for 2 years without ever going home. I asked her why, but she hadn't given me an answer then. But now, she finally gave me the answer. She was trying to forget someone. A friend had once told her that her world was too small, which was why she could only see that one person. That friend suggested she travel, promising that she would realize how vast the world was and that nothing was truly impossible to let go of. She paused, admitting that the world was indeed vast and that she had met all kinds of people over the past 2 years, but her heart was too small, only holding enough room for him. As she spoke, tears slipped from her eyes. I was stunned. She hadn't cried when she took that terrible fall. She hadn't shed a single tear while waiting hopelessly in the bitter blizzard. Yet here she was, large tears rolling down her cheeks and washing over her face, as she confessed that, even though he didn't love her, she simply couldn't forget him. I stayed quiet for a long time before softly telling her that if she couldn't forget, she should just remember. She murmured the words back to herself, repeating the idea of remembering what couldn't be forgotten. Then she suddenly broke into a smile. That smile, blooming amidst her tear tracks, was peculiar yet inexplicably tender, as if she had just recalled the most beautiful thing in her life. She agreed with me, deciding that if she couldn't forget him, she would just hold on to the memory. Leaning exhaustedly against the rock wall, she closed her eyes halfway. She asked me if she didn't make it out of these snowy mountains, whether the peaks, the trees, the rocks, the wind, and all this falling snow would help remember that she had once loved someone with absolutely everything she had. The very first time Avery saw George was on her 12th birthday. She had never seen a boy so strikingly handsome. His features were delicate without being effeminate, yet he radiated an icy, unapproachable aura. These two entirely contradictory vibes didn't clash on him at all. Instead, they made him utterly captivating. Avery fell for George at first sight, though certainly not in a romantic sense. For a 12-year-old girl, affection was purely surface level. She simply thought the older boy was incredibly good-looking and wanted to be around him. George was 16, precocious, painfully quiet, rarely smiled, and had a habit of frowning. His mother, Christine, often teased him for acting like an old soul. Naturally, this mature teenager had zero interest in a little girl who loved running around. He found her childish and obnoxiously loud. During their hour-long car ride, she had talked nonstop the entire time about mindless, empty topics. If his mother hadn't been sitting right next to him, he would have told her to shut up long ago. He just closed his eyes and pretended to sleep, finally finding some peace and quiet. The truth was, he resented the trip to begin with. He had accompanied his mother back from England, and right before they were set to leave, Christine went to visit an old friend of many years, Avery's mother. It happened to be Avery's birthday, so they celebrated together. The birthday girl invited him on her short birthday trip to a nearby lake to see the seagulls, an offer he instinctively declined. But she knew exactly how to maneuver. She whined to Christine, saying her only birthday wish was to go see the seagulls with George. Christine, who adored the girl, naturally agreed. Reluctant as he was, he didn't want to upset his mother, which led to this 5-person road trip. The drive wasn't exactly short, but for George, it felt exceptionally torturous. He opened his eyes and glanced out the window at the increasingly gloomy weather. It was only 3 in the afternoon, but it looked as if night was already falling. The radio was broadcasting a traffic and weather update, warning of possible snowstorms by evening and urging drivers to stay safe on the roads. Seeing him open his eyes, Avery, who was sitting next to him, instantly leaned in and announced that she absolutely loved the snow, asking if he did too. He didn't even bother acknowledging her and simply closed his eyes again. Perhaps he was genuinely exhausted, because it wasn't long before he actually drifted off to sleep. He was jolted awake by a violent impact and a chorus of screams. Just as his eyes snapped open, he felt his body being thrown forcefully at a harsh angle, and reality violently crashed into him. Their car had flipped. Amidst the dizzying tumble and excruciating pain, George felt a heavy weight suddenly drape over him. Then, a familiar scent hit him. It was his mother. She had thrown herself over them, using her own body to shield both him and Avery in her arms. With a deafening crash, the out-of-control vehicle finally came to a halt in a field beneath the highway. Once the terrifying noise faded, an eerie, dead silence and pitch-black darkness swallowed them. Pinned beneath his mother and Avery, George smelled the pungent stench of gasoline, mixed with an even thicker, overpowering reek of blood. The police and ambulances arrived quickly. 4 of the 5 people were unconscious. Only George was still awake. Lying in the ambulance, he listened in a daze as the paramedics and police officers conversed. Drunk driving. The 2 in the front seats died on impact. The woman in the back was critically injured and comatose. The little girl was unconscious. He found the noise unbearable. His head throbbed in agony, his body grew freezing cold, and finally, unable to endure it any longer, he passed out. When he woke up again, he was in a hospital room, being gently shaken awake by a nurse. She told him to hurry to his mother's side, explaining that she didn't have much time left. He froze at first, failing to process the words. Once reality set in, he shot up from the hospital bed and sprinted out the door without even putting on his shoes. By the time George rushed into his mother's room, he found Avery lying across Christine's chest, crying. It wasn't a wail, but a quiet, rhythmic sobbing that made her shoulders tremble. Christine rested her hand on the girl's head, gently stroking her hair. He marched over, violently yanked Avery away, and shoved her hard onto the floor. Without sparing her a glance, he sat down next to his mother's bed. Christine's face was deathly pale, her lips completely drained of color, the undeniable look of someone whose life force was being stripped away thread by thread. Gripping her hand tightly, George felt a crushing wave of panic wash over him as he softly called out to her. But Christine didn't answer him. Instead, she pulled her hand from his grasp, pointed at Avery on the floor, and struggled to tell George to go help her up. He hesitated, glancing at the little girl on the ground. She was still sitting there, looking up at him. A thick white bandage wrapped around her forehead, her face as pale as the gauze itself, and her large eyes were brimming with tears. He looked back at his mother, but her gaze was unwavering. With a hateful glare at Avery, he walked over and pulled her to her feet. Christine smiled in satisfaction, asked Avery to step outside, and then motioned for George to come closer. Avery crouched outside the hospital room, tears pattering onto the floor. Aside from crying, she had no idea what else to do. The hospital felt impossibly cold, and she desperately wanted to crawl into her parents' arms, but down in the morgue, her parents' bodies were even colder than hers. The door to the room suddenly pushed open, and George walked out. His strides were fast, soon breaking into a full sprint, as if something terrifying were chasing him. Avery walked into the room, crying as she called Christine's name over and over, even though she knew Christine would never smile and answer her again. Avery found George on the hospital roof. He was standing by the railing in a thin hospital gown. The night was deepening, and the howling, freezing wind whipped at his clothes, yet he stood perfectly straight, seemingly oblivious to the cold. She stood behind him for a very long time before finally mustering the courage to step forward, tug at the hem of his shirt, and stammer out an apology. He swatted her hand away, as if avoiding a plague. Turning his head, he stared at her with icy eyes, and in a voice even colder than his gaze, he articulated every single word. He told her she was a curse. With that, he turned and walked away. The wind caught the tears streaming down his face. That was the first and only time Avery ever saw George cry. Tears that were silent, restrained, yet overwhelmingly violent and profound. Those tears broke her heart far more than his coldness, or his vicious words ever could. She crouched on the roof, losing track of how long she stayed there. Suddenly, a cold wetness touched her cheek, and she looked up. The delayed snow was finally falling. It was the first snow of the winter, the very thing she loved most in the world, yet she felt absolutely no joy at all. From that day on, she never loved the snow again. Avery's parents' funeral and Christine's funeral were held on the exact same day, in adjacent rooms at the same funeral home. Her uncles managed her family service. Christine's funeral was organized by Mr. Langley, who had rushed over from England. He was George's stepfather. As soon as the service ended, Langley prepared to head back to the UK. Before leaving, he handed George a bank card and offered an apologetic explanation. He told George that with his mother gone, it simply wasn't possible for the two of them to continue living together, and he was sorry. George took the card, shook Langley's hand, and bowed his head in solemn gratitude, thanking him for 12 years of raising him. He didn't blame the man. Langley had done everything that could reasonably be expected of him. George had lost the security of his stepfather. Meanwhile, Avery, now an orphan herself, was being bounced back and forth between her two uncles in the funeral home like a hot potato neither wanted to catch. Nobody was willing to take her in. George stood by the door, watching them bicker until it escalated into a full-blown argument. Avery just kneeled before her parents' portraits with her head down, acting as if the entire dispute had nothing to do with her. George walked right up to the arguing men and cut them off with a cold declaration, telling them to stop shouting because she was going to live with him from now on. The room instantly went dead silent as several pairs of eyes snapped toward him. Avery's head shot up, her eyes wide with pure disbelief. Her uncle's brief hesitation was quickly overshadowed by the sheer relief of finally dumping their problem, and they agreed in unison. George didn't bother to explain further. Without even looking at Avery, he turned and walked out. A week later, Avery left the city with George, heading toward a much colder town up north. The night before they left, George had asked her if she was willing to live with him and his grandmother, warning her that it meant moving to a distant, unfamiliar place. Avery nodded without a second's hesitation. He was somewhat taken aback. They barely knew each other, after all, and she had to know that he disliked her, hated her, even. Yet she was choosing to go with him. Wasn't she afraid? Of course she was afraid. She was confused and deeply puzzled as to why he would want to live with her when he clearly despised her so much. But the memory of his tear-streaked face in the bitter night wind had cemented her decision to follow him. What he didn't know was the silent vow the 12-year-old girl had made the moment she nodded yes. She promised herself that since she had caused him to lose his mother and end up all alone, she would spend the rest of her life keeping him company, being his family. She vowed that it didn't matter how deeply he loathed her. Forced to grow up overnight, she was no longer the spoiled, willful little girl she had been. Guilt and a profound sense of indebtedness had planted a seed deep within her heart, taking root. They endured a grueling bus ride, which required a layover and transfer before finally reaching the small town. While waiting at a gas station, George told Avery to watch the luggage while he went to buy some food. Half an hour slipped by, and with their bus about to depart, he still hadn't returned. Panic finally gripped Avery. She watched the crowds bustling past, not a single familiar face among them, surrounded by a cacophony of voices speaking in accents she could barely decipher. Clutching her backpack's straps tightly, she desperately wanted to go look for him but couldn't abandon the bags. All she could do was pace anxiously within eyeshot of their belongings, standing on her tiptoes to scan the area. That was exactly the site George returned to, carrying milk and bread. When Avery turned and spotted him, she sprinted over. As if doubting her own eyes, she blinked rapidly and reached out to touch his arm. The physical reality of him instantly melted the sheer terror on her face into a massive wave of joy. She let out a huge breath of relief and tilted her head up, beaming at him. She muttered softly that she thought he wasn't coming back. He didn't say a word in response, simply handing her the milk and bread. The truth was, the thought had absolutely crossed his mind, to ditch her in this strange place and leave her to fend for herself. He had even acted on it, walking far enough away before ultimately turning back. Sometime later, Avery asked him why he chose to live with her. He didn't want to answer, but she stubbornly badgered him over and over until he finally snapped in irritation. He asked her if she had ever heard the saying that the best form of revenge was keeping your enemy close to torture them every single day. That, of course, was a lie. The real reason was that looking after her had been Christine's dying wish. He thought his mother must have lost her mind, knowing full well how deeply he despised the girl. But his mother had urged him not to blame Avery, insisting it was a tragic accident, not her fault. Christine had also reminded him that without Avery's mother, he wouldn't even exist, and she herself would have died long ago. It was a story he had grown up hearing. Years ago, his mother had fallen for the wrong man, ended up pregnant and alone, and had been abused by the man before he vanished completely. Pushed to the very edge during her darkest moments, she had been saved by Avery's mother, who stayed by her side through thick and thin. Christine had carried that debt of gratitude her entire life, and in death, she was passing the obligation onto him. He found it absurd, yet he couldn't bring himself to defy her final wish. In looks and temperament, he took nothing from his mother, except for one crucial trait. He viewed promises as sacred, treating them with a gravity greater than life itself. It was snowing in the small town as well, but entirely unlike where they used to live. Here, the snowpack was incredibly deep, turning the world into a vast white void. The wind sliced at their faces like razor blades, and temperatures plummeted to near zero. Avery fell violently ill the very night they arrived, suffering from vomiting and diarrhea before spiking a high fever by midnight. George's grandmother was a renowned herbalist in the town, operating a small clinic right out of her home. In her 60s, the old woman had always been robust, but the sudden, agonizing loss of her daughter seemed to have aged her years in a single night. Still, she stayed up all night caring for the sick girl. When George came to get his grandmother for breakfast the next morning, he caught her nearly collapsing as she tried to stand. He steadied her, shot a venomous glare at Avery sleeping in the bed, and muttered under his breath that the girl was nothing but bad luck. His grandmother scolded him sharply, forbidding him from talking like that. Glancing at Avery, she recalled how the delirious girl had wept and cried out for her mother through the fevered night. She sighed deeply, noting that the poor child had suffered enough already. After they left the room, Avery slowly opened her eyes. She had actually been awake the moment George walked in. Staring at the empty doorway where he had disappeared, her eyes dimmed with sorrow. She already knew perfectly well how much he hated her, and she had promised herself it wouldn't matter. Yet her heart still ached terribly. 3. The drastic shift in climate and environment from south to north kept Avery sick off and on for the entire winter break. That was when her overall health permanently took a turn for the worse. Avery's defining memory of that dead of winter town was the heavy snow swirling outside her window and the sharp, earthy scent of medicinal herbs wafting from the grandmother's workspace. She didn't even get a chance to explore the town properly, confined to the yard to recover her strength. George spent all his time in the yard, too. Having zero interest in the outside world, he preferred to hunker down behind his grandmother's medicine cabinets, thumbing through dusty herbal manuals and meticulously identifying each dried plant, one by one. Whenever Avery walked through the yard, she could always peer through the carved window frames and spot George standing by those cabinets, a manual in one hand as he pulled out herbs to study. He would furrow his brow in concentration, then nod in understanding. His intense focus was utterly captivating. She couldn't help but think that her George was destined to be someone extraordinary one day, just like his grandmother. On New Year's Eve, the grandmother left an empty seat at the dining table for the departed, poured a small glass of water, and bowed her head in a moment of silence. Then, she called the two children over and told George that Avery was part of the family now, instructing him to take care of her and protect her. With a dark scowl, George replied coldly that she was no family of his. Taking in the boy's tightly pressed lips and stubborn defiance, the grandmother didn't push the issue. She sighed inwardly, knowing that no matter how mature he seemed, he was still just a child. She decided to let it be, hoping that time would eventually wash away the bitter knot in his heart. She is not my family. At school, whenever any classmate asked about her, George always threw out that same icy response. After the new year, both were enrolled in the local school system. George went to the high school, and Avery started middle school. They shared the same campus, just in adjacent buildings. Every day at noon, Avery would march over to George's classroom to bring him a homemade lunch. The grandmother was wonderful in every way except in the kitchen. Having grown up in England, George's palate was different, and he found it nearly impossible to stomach the old woman's cooking. The school cafeteria food was equally dismal, so he resorted to grabbing whatever he could from small shops just off campus. Avery had secretly watched him from afar, noting how he would clutch his stomach and sprint to the bathroom right after eating. That very afternoon after school, she bought 2 cookbooks from the bookstore and spent the entire evening locked in the kitchen, rigorously testing recipes over and over again. When the grandmother woke up from her sleep and noticed the kitchen light still on, she walked in, stunned to find the counters in absolute chaos. The stove was fired up, a pot bubbled away, releasing clouds of steam, and there stood Avery, buzzing with energy as she hovered over the pot, her face a mix of nervous anticipation. The old woman looked at the 13-year-old girl, her heart aching with profound pity. But the food Avery finally managed to produce after wasting so many ingredients and running countless trials went completely ignored by George, let alone taken to school. Still, she refused to be discouraged. She started bringing 2 portions of lunch to school every day, packed tightly in an insulated thermos so it stayed piping hot until noon. The second the dismissal bell rang, she would grab the container and sprint at top speed to George's classroom. She'd drop the container on his desk, announce it was his lunch, and walk away immediately. Ever since he rejected her very first delivery, she never gave him a chance to speak. She just dropped the food and fled. She had no idea if he actually ate the meals, but every day after school when she retrieved the thermos, it was scraped clean. She chose to believe he was the one eating it. But this time, George suddenly grabbed her arm, shoved the thermos back into her hands, and coldly ordered her to take it away. Avery pushed the container right back toward him, tilting her head up with a smile as she told him she made braised pork ribs today and practically begged him to try them. George raised his voice, his face twisting in extreme exasperation, and asked her if she couldn't understand plain English, barking at her again to get it out of his sight. With that, He swiped his hand forcefully through the air. The thermos was knocked from Avery's grasp, smashing into the neighboring desk before plummeting to the floor. The lid popped open, sending the hot food spilling everywhere. Avery froze in shock. George seemed briefly taken aback as well. The handful of classmates still lingering in the room fell completely silent at the spectacle. A voice suddenly sliced through the quiet, calling George out for going too far. It was George's desk mate. The boy picked up the empty thermos, handed it back to Avery, and told her that her cooking was delicious and that George simply didn't appreciate it, advising her not to cook for him anymore. Avery stared blankly, wondering how he could possibly know that. George coldly seized the moment, confirming that yes, the other boy had been the one eating all those lunches. He suggested she just deliver the food straight to him from now on, and then he stormed out of the classroom. Staring at his retreating back and then down at the ruined food on the floor, Avery was suddenly hit by a crushing wave of powerlessness. Her mother had once told her that as long as you treat someone with genuine kindness, they will eventually feel it and repay you with the same warmth. But Mom, she thought, if that person hates and despises you from the very beginning, does it mean that no matter how good you are to him, you'll never earn even a passing glance or a single smile? Every time George directed his freezing glares and harsh words her way, Avery had comforted herself countless times by reasoning that he simply had a cold personality, that he didn't smile at her, but he didn't smile at anyone else either. Yet when she stood outside his classroom and looked through the window, she watched him accept a lunchbox from the girl sitting next to him and actually offer her a small smile. It was the first time Avery had ever seen him smile. The slight curve of his lips was subtle and faint, yet it broke across his face like the sun piercing through after a heavy snowfall. Achingly handsome and incredibly warm. But such precious warmth didn't belong to her. Avery clutched her empty thermos tight to her chest and quietly turned away. Instead of returning to her own class, she slipped out the back gate of the school and climbed the hillside behind it, where an apple orchard sat. Spring was in full swing, and the apple trees were bursting with pristine white blossoms, casting a faint, sweet fragrance through the air. She took a deep breath, letting the floral scent suppress the relentless waves of sorrow crashing inside her. Sitting down on the grass against an apple tree, she opened the lunch she had originally made for George and began shoveling it into her mouth. Eating far too quickly, she began to choke and hack violently until tears welled up in her eyes, more and more tears, dripping straight into the food. Through blurred, tearful eyes, she realized that seeing him smile at someone else hurt far, far worse than enduring his cruelest insults. After that day, Avery never made lunch for George again. She didn't need to. Someone else had taken over the job. She recognized the girl from the school bulletin boards. Her name was Sloane, and she was in George's class. Sloane wasn't just a top student. She came from a good family, was gorgeous, and excelled in a variety of talents. She was the golden girl everyone envied, and standing next to the equally brilliant George, they truly looked like a match made in heaven. During the end-of-year school showcase, Avery watched them perform Romeo and Juliet together. Every movement, every shared glance was flawlessly in sync. Amidst the thunderous applause, Avery quietly slipped out of the auditorium. It was snowing again. Winter here meant endless, unceasing snow. Avery tilted her head up, letting the feather-like flakes fall onto her hair and face. Time flew by so fast. In the blink of an eye, it had been almost a year since she arrived in this small town. George came home very late that night. Looking out from her bedroom window, Avery watched him slowly walk across the yard with his backpack, snow covering his shoulders. He stood under the eaves, brushing the snow off his clothes. She desperately wanted to push open the window and wish him a happy new year, but she figured he wouldn't care for it anyway. People always said time was the best medicine, but for her and George, time only seemed to tangle their estrangement and his resentment into tighter, thicker knots. And she was utterly powerless to stop it. The summer she turned 14, Avery shot up almost 2 inches. The grandmother joked that the cold northern air and home-cooked meals were good for her. But it wasn't just her height that was changing. Her body was undergoing new transformations, things her mother had passed away before having the chance to explain. So when her first period arrived, Avery was completely panicked. It was a Friday in June. The grandmother and George had waited for her to come home for dinner. but the sky turned completely dark, and she still hadn't returned. After eating, the grandmother told George to go look for her. Reluctantly, he went straight to her classroom, only expecting to take a quick look, but to his surprise, she was actually there. The lights in the classroom were off, leaving only the faint, hazy moonlight filtering through the windows. Avery lay slumped over her desk, completely motionless. Did she fall asleep here? Didn't she know he and his grandmother were waiting for her to eat dinner? George's already dark expression deepened into a scowl. He walked over, rapped his knuckles on her desk, and snapped to get her attention. Avery's head snapped up. George froze. She was crying, her face streaked with tears. She called out his name. A tiny spark of joy and disbelief suddenly broke through her tear-stained face. He furrowed his brow, asking her what she was doing here instead of going home. Avery stammered, unable to speak clearly. He lost his patience, demanding to know what was wrong. Avery lowered her head and whispered that her stomach hurt, that she had gotten her first period. George froze. He glanced at the awkward way she was sitting and finally understood. He gave her one look, turned on his heel, and quickly walked out. The tiny sliver of hope that had just ignited inside Avery dimmed the moment his figure vanished. However, a few minutes later, George actually returned. He handed a bag to a stunned Avery, muttered for her to go to the bathroom, and walked back out. But he didn't go far, merely standing right outside the classroom. Avery sat in a daze for a second before clutching her stomach, hunching over slightly, and shuffling slowly toward the girls' restroom. George waited for a long time, and when she didn't come back, he had no choice but to go find her. From down the hall, he spotted her crouching outside the restroom, her small body curled into a tight ball as her fingers pressed into her abdomen. Hearing his footsteps, Avery looked up. Her eyebrows were knit together, her face scrunched up in obvious agony. She forced the words out, apologizing to George and explaining that her stomach hurt so badly, telling him to go home first while she rested for a bit. He interrupted her, ordering her to get on. Turning around, he suddenly crouched down in front of her. Avery was dumbfounded. Was he offering to carry her on his back? He urged her impatiently to hurry up. Avery blinked, then discreetly pinched her own arm. It hurt. This wasn't a dream. Staring at his broad back, she hesitated for a second before gently and carefully leaning against him. The moment her body registered his warmth, Avery's tears came crashing down. She hadn't cried in a very long time, and unlike the freezing tears of the past, these were scalding hot, filled with joy and warmth. She thanked him, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck and burying her face into the crook of his shoulder. Despite her choked-up voice, the corners of her lips were curving upward. The dampness of her hot tears soaking through his shirt and touching his skin made George stiffen. He paused his steps slightly and muttered for her not to read too much into it, claiming he just didn't want his grandmother to worry. Avery didn't say a word. Through her tears, she took a gentle, deep breath. This was the closest she had ever been to him, and she could smell his scent, a faint, clean fragrance that reminded her of dew-kissed grass on a summer morning. It absolutely mesmerized her. Avery lifted her head and murmured that the moonlight tonight was truly beautiful. It was in this exact moment that she truly fell in love with him. On her 15th birthday, Avery received her first ever confession of love. The boy was a senior in the high school named Blake. Everything Avery knew about him came from her desk mate's gossip. That he threw his weight around school relying on his family's wealth and power, and mostly about his romantic exploits. That he was only 17 but had already gone through several girlfriends, never keeping one for more than 3 months. Avery found it utterly baffling when she received a gift from him. She didn't even know the guy. And how did he know when her birthday was? Ever since she turned 12, she had stopped celebrating her birthday entirely. She returned the gift to him. Blake was shocked, and then slightly enraged. It was likely the first time a girl had rejected him to his face, and his pride and ego took a hit. That night, after the final bell rang, he cornered Avery in a secluded section of the school parking lot. She had been the last one to leave, and there were no other students around. When Blake clamped a hand over her mouth and forcefully dragged her away, her screams and overwhelming terror were entirely smothered. Blake dragged her all the way to the back gate of the school, an area completely devoid of streetlights and swallowed in pitch black. He pinned her against the perimeter wall, leaned down, and forced a kiss on her. It was a completely alien scent. The moment their lips met, Avery felt nothing but sheer disgust, profound, nauseating disgust. Then her tears fell, born of pure terror and desperation. She struggled violently, but it was utterly useless. As if punishing her, the boy viciously bit her lip. Avery tasted the faint metallic tang of blood, which made her gag. She flailed her hands wildly, and in the chaos, her fingers brushed against the utility knife in the side pocket of her backpack. Without a second thought, she pulled it out and drove it fiercely into the boy's body. The excruciating pain finally made Blake let go of her. He let out a groan of agony, clutching his waist as he dropped to a crouch. Through her tear-filled eyes, Avery watched thick blood pulse through his fingers and pool on the ground. A shocking, gruesome sight. His face was nearly contorted in pain. In that moment, she finally realized what she had done. Her hands began to shake violently. She abruptly dropped the utility knife, backing away step by step, further and further, before turning and running as fast as she could. She ran the whole way, tears streaming down her face. She made it all the way to the front gates before suddenly turning back and sprinting toward the high school building. When she reached the outside of George's classroom, he was just packing up his bag, with Sloane standing right beside him waiting. She wanted to turn and leave, but her feet refused to move. When George walked out and saw her covered in tears and trembling uncontrollably, it startled him badly. He asked her what was wrong. She called his name, her voice shaking terribly. George gripped her shoulders, demanding to know what had happened. She stuttered that she had hurt someone. The perpetually aloof George was shaken to the core, asking her what she just said. At the hospital, Blake was rushed into surgery, marking the beginning of an agonizingly long wait. Blake's parents arrived shortly after. His mother, tears streaming down her face, raised her hand and slapped Avery hard across the cheek. Still unsatisfied, she raised her hand to strike again, but someone caught her wrist in midair. George coldly told the woman to get her facts straight first. He glanced at Avery, pointing out that she wouldn't just stab someone without a reason, and asked the woman why she wasn't questioning what her own son had done. Sloane asked Avery what exactly had happened that night. Avery kept her head bowed and didn't make a sound. Assuming Avery had nothing to say for herself, Blake's mother let out a cold snort, declaring that no matter what happened, her son was lying in an operating room with his life hanging in the balance, while Avery was standing there perfectly fine. She told old James to call the police. Blake's father pulled out his phone and was about to dial when George threw his arm out to stop him. Fury churned in George's eyes, and his voice was thick with anger as he stated that Blake had tried to assault her and had even bitten her. Blake's father froze. Avery kept her face buried in her hands, her head down. Sloane gave George a long, hard look. A brief silence hung in the air before Blake's mother shrieked, asking what nonsense he was spouting, demanding to know if he had seen it with his own eyes, and challenging him to produce any evidence. During the moment George remained silent, she whipped out her own phone and dialed 911. As the police led Avery away, she kept looking back over her shoulder at George. She wasn't crying, but tears pooled heavily in her eyes, forming a thick, wet mist. She was too terrified to even speak. Her lips trembled uncontrollably, and the torn, bloody wound on her lip looked horrific. She seemed to be mouthing his name. George clenched his fists tight, his face livid, but he could only watch helplessly as she was taken away. He hadn't witnessed it firsthand. There were no security cameras at the back gate of the school, and Blake was still in surgery. Even if the boy woke up, there was a good chance he would deny everything anyway. He turned to look at Sloane, who was already watching him. After a long while, he told her he needed to speak with her. They walked to the end of the hallway where a window was wide open. Freezing wind howled through it, carrying fine flakes of snow. He had said he needed to speak, but he stood there in silence for a long time. Sloane waited for a moment before noting that he wanted her to convince her aunt not to press charges against Avery. By pure coincidence, Blake was Sloane's cousin. George said yes. Sloane offered a small smile and agreed. George stayed silent, waiting for her next words. Sure enough, she followed up by asking if he would reconsider the proposition she had made to him earlier. George's expression didn't change as he asked flatly if that was her condition. Sloane lifted her chin, biting her lip, and confirmed that it was. He accepted her terms. With that, he turned and walked away. Sloane's voice rang out behind him, asking George if he truly hated Avery. He paused his steps for a fraction of a second, but he didn't turn around, nor did he offer an answer. By the time Avery was released from the police station, it was already 11:30 at night. Blake was out of danger. The second she walked out the doors, she spotted George standing under a streetlight. His back was turned to her, both hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. His head was bowed slightly, as if he were deeply engrossed in thought. The street lamp stretched his shadow out long across the pavement. Snow had begun to fall from the sky again, swirling like willow catkins under the dim yellow light, landing softly on his hair and his shoulders. Avery stood behind him, quietly staring at his back as her eyes began to sting. She called his name. He turned his head, gave her a brief glance, and told her that he had informed their grandmother they were attending a friend's party tonight. Avery nodded in understanding. He didn't say anything else, simply turning to leave. His strides were fast, making it hard for Avery to keep up. Under the streetlights, two shadows, one tall, one short, moved across the snow, one leading the other. She called his name again. He turned around and, seeing her standing still, furrowed his brow. She bit her lip, asking if he didn't hate her anymore. He immediately turned and walked away. Avery broke into a light jog to catch up, throwing her arm out to block his path. She tilted her head up to look at him, demanding to know if it was true. Her face was a mix of eager anticipation and nervous tension. Her large eyes, dark and shining, were tilted up as she waited for his reply. He was momentarily thrown off by the nervous hope in her eyes, but reality quickly snapped back into focus. He remembered exactly what day it was. It was the anniversary of his mother's death. His expression turned utterly frigid, matching his voice as he told her she was overthinking it. He explained that the only reason he stepped in was because his grandmother was getting old, and he didn't want her worrying about Avery. He went on, reminding her that she had always wanted to know why he despised her yet still chose to live with her. He finally gave her the answer, because it was his mother's dying wish. He asked her bitterly if she genuinely believed he would ever care about her or want to see her face if it weren't for that promise. He told her unequivocally that he hated her in the past, he hated her now, and that was never going to change. He begged her to just stay away from him, to behave herself and stop causing trouble, because he didn't have the time to keep cleaning up her messes. He had never spoken so many words to her at one time, yet in that moment, every single sentence drove into her heart like a sharpened blade. She watched his back as he slowly walked away, a thick mist of tears welling up in her eyes. On New Year's Eve, another heavy snow fell all day. Pushing open the door revealed a yard buried in pristine white. Sitting beneath her desk lamp, Avery carefully used a marker to write a single line of text on a large piece of white cardstock. Ever blooming, evergreen, the roses never feel the years. She set the pen down, stepped back slightly, and looked down to inspect her work. The grandmother walked past carrying a freshly baked tray of cookies, caught a glimpse of the words, and stopped in her tracks. She told Avery that it wasn't a good line. Avery replied that she thought it was perfectly fine. Ever blooming, evergreen. The word, ever, was a piece of her own name. Writing that line down on paper felt like harboring a tiny, sweet secret in her heart, like hiding a piece of candy. The grandmother shook her head, suggesting she write a different one. The old woman explained that the very next line of the poem was, ever passing, ever gone. The faces blur and disappear. She added that on New Year's Eve, she didn't want the girl writing a poem like that. Avery wrote out a more festive, appropriate phrase right in front of her grandmother. But she didn't throw away the original piece of cardstock. She secretly taped it to the wall of her bedroom. Just the first half of the poem, standing all alone against the blank white wall. Lying in bed, she could just turn her head to see that line. The corners of her mouth curled up slightly, only to be followed by a soft, quiet sigh. George had said he wanted her to stay away from him. If that would make him feel better, then no matter how desperately she wanted to speak to him, she would force herself to hold back. When George walked past her room, he glanced in and noticed that piece of cardstock on the wall with its single, isolated line of text. He muttered internally that it looked completely awkward. Ever since that night at the police station, the relationship between them had grown even more strained than before. In truth, it hadn't been great to begin with. He never initiated a conversation with her. It was always her, shamelessly yet anxiously trying to spark up a chat with him. He usually couldn't be bothered to respond, but she would constantly bring her science and math homework to him for help. Constantly badgered by his grandmother, he was forced to tutor her. But now, she didn't even come to him for that anymore. For the first few days, he was thrilled to have the peace and quiet. But gradually, for some inexplicable reason, as he sat studying under his desk lamp, his mind would begin to drift. It was as if he could still hear her timid voice right next to his ear, exclaiming that she was so stupid for not understanding such a simple problem. He would turn his head slightly, but under the pool of light, there was absolutely nothing but his own shadow. They lived under the exact same roof and saw each other every single day, yet they existed like two complete strangers. This state of affairs dragged on until the early summer of the following year, when Avery learned from the grandmother that George would be moving to England for college after he graduated high school. She burst into his room without even knocking and immediately demanded to know if he was going to England. She had just finished taking a shower and was still wearing her pajamas, her hair dripping wet as she stood right in front of him. He was momentarily taken aback, but before he could even open his mouth, someone else answered for him. Yes, and he is going with me. Only then did Avery realize that there was someone else in the room. It was Sloane. She was holding a stack of documents, just getting ready to leave. He was going to England, and he was going with Sloane. If the first piece of news was a hand grenade, the second was equivalent to an atomic bomb. Avery stared at Sloane, and Sloane looked right back at her before offering a smile tinged with the unmistakable smugness of a victor. It was the kind of silent, electric clash that only existed between teenage girls. Avery had feelings for George. Sloane had figured that out a long time ago. As for George, she cast a glance at him, deciding it no longer mattered. He had already agreed to go to England with her for 3 years of university. She refused to believe that living together day in and day out in a foreign country wouldn't eventually melt his indifference toward her. After Sloane left, a heavy silence fell between the two of them. After a long time, Avery finally stammered out a quiet question, asking if he had to go. George simply replied that it was late and he was going to bed. Avery pressed on, reminding him that their grandmother was getting old and her health was declining. She asked why he had to run off to somewhere so far away, questioning if he was leaving just because he hated the sight of her, and if he truly despised her that much. George refused to look at her, turning his back to start packing up the books on his desk. Met with his deafening silence, Avery fought back her tears, turned around, and quietly walked out. Ever since she learned that George was leaving to study abroad, Avery felt that time was slipping away faster than ever before. She counted down the days. She completely threw his demand to stay away from him out the window and reverted to her old ways, seizing every possible opportunity to pester him with conversation and homework questions. She didn't care if he thought she was shameless, and it didn't matter how many cold glares he shot her way. Since they were destined to be separated, she desperately wanted to build just a few more memories between them, even if those moments meant absolutely nothing to him. For her, they were the most beautiful dreams she had. He was graduating from high school, and she was finishing middle school. After the final exams, the grades held their usual celebratory dinners. That day, acting as if she had been struck by the agonizing grief of impending separation, Avery went around like a madwoman clinking her soda glass with every single classmate. Everyone assumed she was celebrating some incredibly good news. After dinner, the group moved to a classmate's house to keep the party going. But after riding such a prolonged emotional high, a wave of sheer exhaustion crashed over Avery, and she passed out on the sofa. She stayed dead to the world until the party completely wrapped up. Her desk mate, who was her closest friend, tried several times to haul her up, but it was impossible. Out of options, her friend finally gave George a call. When George arrived and saw her in that state, his face darkened. He yanked her up and gave her a shake, but she just collapsed against him like a boneless rag doll, slumping into his arms and refusing to stand. Muttering about how much of a nuisance she was, George let out a scoff, hoisted her onto his back, and carried her out the door. This was the second time he had carried her like this, and only the second time they had ever been in such close physical contact. Her head rested heavily in the crook of his neck, and the faint, sweet scent of her breath brushed softly against his nose. His strides were unhurried. He supported her weight firmly as he walked at a slow, deliberate pace. It was the dead of night in midsummer. The sweltering heat had finally dissipated, and the midnight breeze carried a refreshing chill that swept over both of them. A taxi slowed down beside them, but he waved it off and kept walking straight ahead. The night sky was simply too beautiful, the evening breeze too gentle, and since he was about to leave this small town for good, he just wanted to walk a little further and take in the nighttime scenery a few more times. That had to be the reason. At least, that was what George told himself. Suddenly, he felt a cool, soft touch press against his cheek and linger there for a long moment. He faltered mid-step. She murmured his name, confessing that she really liked him. That she really, really liked him. The girl's whisper sounded almost like sleep-talking as it brushed softly against his ear. He thought she had woken up. He stood frozen in place for a long time, but all he heard in return was the slow, steady rhythm of her deep breathing. Right. She was just talking in her sleep. The corner of his mouth twitched, and he started walking again. Beneath the glow of the neon lights, he couldn't see that the girl resting on his shoulder had her eyes wide open, shining as bright as the stars. From the summer she turned 15 to the summer she turned 18, Avery didn't see George a single time. She only occasionally spoke to him on the phone when their grandmother passed the receiver to her. The conversations were always strictly about the old woman, lasting only a few brief sentences before he hung up. Throughout her 3 years of high school, she became incredibly busy, pouring all her time and energy into her studies, focusing heavily on science and math, and obsessively rewriting her college application essay over a dozen times. Her singular goal was the university George attended in England. She knew that with his stellar academic record, he was bound to build his life and career over there. No matter how grueling her studies got, she made sure to write a letter every single night before going to bed. Sometimes they were long, sometimes short. Sometimes she recounted the mundane details of her daily life, and other times she wrote nothing more than a single sentence telling him she had a delicious cup of hot chocolate that day and that she missed him terribly. None of the letters had a greeting or a signature. They read more like the private, internal monologues of a diary. She always used pale pink stationery and plain white envelopes. The following afternoon, she would bury the letter beneath the trees in the apple orchard behind the school. 3 years. Over 1,000 days and nights. Over 1,000 letters. The soil beneath countless trees in that apple orchard became the silent keeper of all her secrets. It was the most beautiful, delicate secret of Avery's entire life, holding the heaviest, most profound love she would ever know. During the winter of Avery's senior year, the grandmother suffered a sudden cerebral hemorrhage and slipped into a coma. Once hospitalized, she was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor. Holding the medical report, Avery stood completely frozen, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The old woman, on the other hand, was far more optimistic. She comforted Avery, reasoning that for a woman in her 70s, it was perfectly normal to have a few ailments. She strictly forbade Avery from telling George. He was working his way through college in England, scraping by, and a single plane ticket home would cost him an entire month's wages. The grandmother felt she wasn't at death's door just yet, so there was no need to cause him any panic. Avery went to speak with the doctor and learned that the tumor was caught in its early stages. If they operated, there was a chance she could live for several more years. But the old woman adamantly refused the surgery. Avery knew the real reason. She was terrified of the astronomical medical bills. Avery didn't push the issue any further. She simply hired a caregiver to look after the grandmother, and then vanished for an entire week. When she reappeared, she placed a check right in front of the old woman, bearing an amount more than enough to cover the cost of the surgery. The grandmother stared at her in utter shock, demanding to know where she got that kind of money. Having barely slept during her travels, Avery had faint, dark circles under her eyes. She took the grandmother's hand and assured her not to worry, promising she hadn't stolen or robbed anyone for it. She had sold the house her parents left her. The old woman, who had been fiercely strong her entire life, suddenly found her eyes welling up with tears in front of the young girl, murmuring affectionately about what a foolish child she was. Avery told her not to worry about a thing, and to just focus on getting through the surgery. The old woman let out a soft sigh, knowing full well that Avery had done this largely for George's sake. She asked Avery if she was in love with George. Avery lowered her head. Her bashful demeanor gave the grandmother all the answer she needed. But in truth, Avery didn't do it solely for George. After living together for so many years, the grandmother had treated her with such deep kindness and care that Avery had long since considered her to be true family. The surgery was a complete success, and they thought the worst was over. But just a few months later, the cancer returned with a vengeance, far worse than the first time. The grandmother had suffered a sudden seizure while walking down the stairs and collapsed, resulting in a massive cranial hemorrhage. She slipped into a deep coma, her life hanging by the thinnest of threads. Looking through the glass window of the intensive care unit, Avery watched her unconscious grandmother. The old woman was hooked up to countless tubes and monitors, making it feel as if one could physically watch her life force draining away second by second. Even though it was the peak of summer, Avery felt unbearably cold, as if she had been violently dragged back to when she was 12, standing in that same freezing hospital where her parents and Christine had died. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, tears streaming silently down her face. George flew back 2 days later, rushing straight from the airport to the hospital, completely exhausted from the journey. Just as he pushed the door to the ward open, Avery was walking out. Their eyes met, and both of them froze for a fraction of a second. 1,000 unspoken words seemed to hang in that single, loaded gaze. 3 long years had rushed by. Avery had rehearsed countless opening lines for the moment they finally reunited. Yet standing there now, her chest tightened with grief, her throat seized up, and she couldn't force out a single syllable. He thanked her. That was the first thing George said to her, and it was the one and only time in all those years he had ever offered her a word of gratitude. A profound bitterness flooded Avery's heart. His thanks sounded completely sincere, yet painfully distant. She viewed him and their grandmother as the only family she had left in the entire world, but clearly, he didn't feel the same way about her. The grandmother passed away the very night George returned. She had somehow managed to wake from her coma, clinging desperately to a life that had already reached its end, all just to see her grandson one last time. Avery lay across the old woman's body, crying uncontrollably. Whether she was 12 or 18, she simply couldn't handle the crushing weight of saying goodbye. With her final ounce of strength, the grandmother weakly patted Avery's head and asked her to step outside, so she could speak with George alone. It felt like time was looping back on itself. It was exactly like Christine's final moments. As Avery slowly walked toward the door, glancing back over her shoulder, a sudden, inexplicable sense of panic began to rise in her chest. She crouched outside the hospital room, waiting for a long time before George finally emerged. Through her sobs, she tried to ask him about their grandmother. Instead, he suddenly grabbed her arm and dragged her forward with vicious force. He hauled her all the way to the stairwell, slammed the heavy fire door shut, and shoved her hard against the wall. He glared down at her, his eyes blazing with intense fury and a sharp edge of mockery. Terrified by the sheer venom in his stare, Avery stammered his name. He abruptly shot his hand out, seizing her tightly by the throat, and ordered her never to say his name. He seemed to have reached the absolute breaking point of his rage. His perpetually calm face twisted into a vicious snarl, his eyes burning with a fire that looked ready to reduce her to ashes. He was genuinely choking her, his grip brutally tight. Avery struggled to breathe, feeling the terrifying onset of suffocation as her throat squeezed out nothing but fractured, strangled gasps. Utterly paralyzed by fear and shock, her eyes widened as tears quickly pooled into a thick mist before spilling over, streaming heavily down her cheeks. Through clenched teeth, George demanded to know what the hell she had said to their grandmother. He asked her if she knew how to cast hexes, spitting out how absurd it was that his mother forced him to take care of her, and now his grandmother was actually forcing him to marry her. He found the entire situation utterly laughable and sickeningly grotesque. Avery gasped desperately for air, her face turning ghastly pale as her tears fell with even greater, more devastating despair. He finally released his crushing grip on her throat. She slowly slid down the wall until she hit the floor, hugging her arms around herself and shaking violently. She just kept murmuring over and over that she hadn't done it, that she hadn't said anything. George stared down at her, the blinding rage in his eyes seemingly clearing just a fraction. The explosive fury faded, leaving behind a mess of complicated emotions, a trace of crushing sorrow, a flicker of unbearable pity, and a profound, paralyzing confusion. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but in the end, he swallowed the words, turned his back, and walked away in silence. Avery placed a bouquet of flowers at the base of the tombstone, bowing her head in silence for a very long time. She whispered to her grandmother that she was leaving soon and wouldn't be able to visit her again for a very long time. Staring at the name carved into the stone, she still couldn't comprehend how someone as remarkably perceptive as the grandmother could make such an outrageous demand of George. Didn't the old woman know that a promise like that would only make George hate her even more? Yet, she couldn't bring herself to blame the old woman. She knew the demand was rooted purely in love, just like Christine's dying wish years ago. It was born out of profound gratitude and overwhelming love. She remembered the words George had spoken right before he boarded his flight back to England. Standing by the front gate in the faint light of dawn, she had watched him leave. He took a few steps, then suddenly turned around to look at her from a distance. With absolutely nothing but freezing indifference in his dark eyes, he told her that he would honor his promise to their grandmother. He declared that he would marry her, but he would never, ever love her. Over the years, George had hurled countless cold, even vicious insults at her, but none of them had ever struck her quite like those words. They left her feeling stranded on the peak of a frozen glacier, piercing her heart like a needle, over and over again. But despite the agony, she was still a moth, throwing herself recklessly and blindly into the raging fire that was George. In late July, she received an acceptance letter from a university in England. Even though it wasn't her absolute top choice, she still broke down in tears of sheer joy. Just like when she was 12 years old, knowing full well that he loathed and despised her, she still wanted to stand by his side. Back then, it was because of a silent promise she had made deep in her heart. But now, beyond that promise, the more vital truth was that she was completely in love with him. At the very end of the summer before she turned 18, Avery flew to England alone. Because her flight was scheduled to land late at night, she called George before leaving. His roommate answered the phone, and she had no way of knowing if the guy actually passed her message along. She hadn't held out much hope that he would actually show up at the airport. So when she walked out of the arrival gates and spotted his figure, the crushing exhaustion of the long journey vanished instantly. He coldly remarked that she really refused to let him go, asking mockingly if she had chased him all the way to England just to make sure he wouldn't back out of his promise. His dripping sarcasm made the smile she hadn't even fully formed wither away. A deep, heavy sense of powerlessness washed over her. She had tried to explain the truth behind their grandmother's absurd dying wish, but he fundamentally refused to believe her. When someone hates you that much, she realized, anything you say will only ever sound like a pathetic excuse. Rain fell continuously from the sky, pattering lightly against the taxi's windows. Avery rested her head against the cold glass, staring out at the foggy, rain-soaked streets. She felt as if the dreary dampness outside had seeped straight into her own heart. George brought Avery back to his rented apartment. It was just one cramped, run-down room in a shared house, but he kept it immaculately clean. Aside from a single bed and a small wardrobe, the only other furniture was a heavy wooden desk and chair, the surface buried under stacks of books. Avery looked around the room, her gaze inevitably landing on the narrow single bed. George was already pulling a blanket from the closet and spreading it directly onto the floor. Avery offered to sleep on the floor instead. George shot her a sidelong glance, telling her to just wash up and go to sleep because he was tired. Lying in his bed, Avery found it impossible to fall asleep. This was the first time they had ever shared a room. Lying so incredibly close that in the dead silence, she could hear the rhythm of his breathing. She turned slightly onto her side and buried her face in his pillow. It was entirely saturated with his clean scent, and she took deep, careful breaths just to take it in. She whispered his name, asking if he was asleep. The only response she got was complete silence. The rain outside continued its steady drizzle. Avery stared at George's back. The room was dark, save for the faint, hazy glow of the street lamp filtering through the window and washing over him, casting him in a quiet, dreamlike stillness. Avery's voice sounded equally distant as she told him that, whether he believed it or not, she was only going to say this one last time. She swore she hadn't manipulated the situation. She insisted she had never used any dirty tricks against him, that she simply loved him with a pure, uncomplicated affection. She told him that it was fine if he didn't love her back, but begged him not to misunderstand her intentions. The only answer she received was the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. She lay awake for the rest of the night, listening to the relentless sound of the rain. The next day, George dropped her off at her university. As he was leaving, he coldly advised her not to seek him out unless there was an absolute emergency. Watching his retreating back, a thick, overwhelming bitterness flooded Avery's heart. He was the only reason she had crossed the world to this endlessly rainy, foreign land. But she promised herself, if keeping her distance was what he truly wanted, she would grant him exactly that. Her campus wasn't too far from his apartment. She picked up the habit of running at night, starting from outside her dorm and ending exactly below his building. She would stand directly under the street lamp, tilting her head back to look up at his window. The warm yellow light would be on, and she could watch his silhouette move back and forth across the glass. She would stand there, staring for a very long time. On rainy nights, she would carry a large black umbrella, stepping through puddles as she walked slowly to his building, taking her place under that exact same street lamp to look up. Passers-by would constantly throw her strange, curious glances, but she completely ignored them, anchoring herself to the sidewalk like a physical signpost, enduring it all just to catch a blurry glimpse of his shadow. From the warmth of summer through the bitter freeze of winter, and straight into spring, she walked that path from her school to his apartment so many times she could navigate it flawlessly with her eyes closed. For 8 solid months, she never once showed her face to him. The next time Avery saw George was in the early summer of the following year. She had suffered a sudden, severe bout of acute gastroenteritis in the middle of the night and was rushed to the hospital by her roommate. That roommate, who was the only real friend Avery had made in England and knew all about her hidden heartbreak, secretly made a phone call to George. When Avery opened her eyes early the next morning, she saw him sitting right next to her hospital bed. Convinced she was dreaming, she squeezed her eyes shut and opened them again. He was still there. Her tears instantly broke loose, pouring down her face. When the illness struck, the abdominal pain had been absolutely excruciating, yet she hadn't shed a single tear. But the moment she saw him, it was as if all the agonizing hardship, the quiet devastation, and the suffocating longing of the past months had finally found a valve to release the pressure. Frowning, he handed her a tissue, asking her how old she was to still be crying at the drop of a hat. She refused to take it. She just lay there, staring up at him through tear-blurred eyes, as if desperately trying to carve the exact details of his face permanently into her memory. He demanded to know why she hadn't bothered to call him when she got sick. Avery cried even harder, her quiet voice trembling with raw grievance as she reminded him that he was the one who told her never to seek him out. He started to retort, but was cut off. Suddenly, the door to the room swung open. Someone carrying a large bouquet of fresh flowers peeked their head in, greeting Avery and remarking that it had been a long time. It really had been a long time. It was Sloane. She had grown even more stunning, with large, cascading curls, flawless makeup, and massive sunglasses perched on her face, making her look like a movie star. But given their history, Avery knew perfectly well that their relationship was nowhere near the level of bringing flowers for a hospital visit. Sloane set the flowers down, seamlessly hooked her arm through George's, and told him it was time to go because everyone else had already arrived and was waiting for him. Her tone and gestures were dripping with total intimacy. George furrowed his brow and looked as if he wanted to pull his arm free, but when he caught Avery staring intensely at their interlocked arms, he froze and didn't pull away. George stated flatly that since she was fine, he was leaving. Sloane offered a tiny smile, promising that they would come back to visit her later. That smile was exactly the same smug, victorious smirk she had flashed in George's bedroom all those years ago. They. The most devastatingly intimate pronoun in the world. Watching them walk out together, arm in arm, Avery felt as though she had been forcefully ripped back through time. Once again, she was standing at the very back of the school auditorium, staring across the vast distance at the center stage where, under the bright lights, he and Sloane stood together, just as intimate, just as untouchable. The years had violently rushed past. No matter how the seasons shifted, and no matter how desperately she clawed her way forward to stand beside him, the spot right next to him would never, ever belong to her. After that hospital stay, George actually started calling her on occasion. Even though the conversations were brief, spanning only a few sentences, it gave Avery an overwhelming sense of satisfaction. For so many years, all it took was the tiniest scrap of warmth from him to instantly soothe away the grueling agony and the suffocating, hopeless longing of her darkest nights. Avery couldn't fathom what Sloane was plotting. Ever since that hospital visit, the other girl had started aggressively asking her out to meet up, grabbing meals, drinking tea, going shopping, acting completely as if they were long-lost best friends catching up. Avery strongly disliked her, but she couldn't bring herself to refuse the invitations. Sloane was the only source of information she had about George's life. That summer, George graduated from university. He, Sloane, and a British friend partnered up to launch an art gallery. Because the startup phase was so grueling, George became phenomenally busy, constantly flying all over the world. Naturally, Avery saw even less of him. He never shared his travel itinerary with her, leaving Sloane as Avery's absolute only pipeline for updates. But Sloane never gave her much, just a few breadcrumbs before seamlessly changing the subject. Eventually, Avery figured out the brutal truth. Sloane's entire goal in meeting up was just to sip her coffee, wear that faint little smile, and watch Avery writhe in silent agony, desperately wanting to ask about him but too proud to actually do it. It was completely sick. But knowing exactly what Sloane was doing, yet still voluntarily subjecting herself to the girl's smug, mocking victory lap, didn't that make her just as sick? Avery thought bitterly to herself. People who love with such pathetic, stubborn desperation never truly have a choice. George was a natural-born businessman. Sloane had majored in fine arts and possessed top-tier artistic taste, and their British partner brought in an elite network of local contacts. In just 2 short years, their humble gallery exploded from a tiny startup into a massive company, forcing them to relocate to a significantly larger venue. To celebrate the grand reopening and their 2-year anniversary, the gallery threw a massive gala. An invitation and a formal gown were delivered to Avery just as she finished her shift at work. Picking up the ankle-length, lake blue dress, she couldn't help but genuinely admire Sloane's impeccable taste. The girl had never even asked for her measurements, yet the gown fit her as if it had been custom-tailored. The party was hosted right inside the new gallery. By the time Avery arrived, the massive space was already packed shoulder to shoulder with people. Guests milled about with champagne flutes making polite conversation, while others stood in quiet admiration before the oil paintings lining the walls. Standing at the entrance, Avery spotted George instantly through the thick crowd. He was wearing a sharp black suit and tight night, and as he raised his glass to take a sip, his silver cufflinks caught the light in a sharp glint. It was the very first time Avery had ever seen him dressed with such formal sophistication. The way he turned his head slightly to chat, his every gesture radiating the refined elegance of a mature man. Yet, looking at him now, her mind flashed violently back to the 12-year-old version of herself, seeing him for the very first time. A boy wrapped in a black British overcoat and a charcoal scarf, his mouth set in a hard, stubborn line as he sat next to his mother, refusing to speak a single word. That freezing, volatile teenage boy had grown into a strikingly handsome, composed man. Sloane, who had been standing right next to George, walked over with a glass in her hand, greeting Avery by name and welcoming her. Hearing the name, George looked her way. A brief flicker of surprise crossed his eyes, but his expression instantly smoothed back into its usual calm. Sloane guided her over to George's side and introduced her to a few of their friends, referring to Avery as her younger schoolmate and a dear friend. Internally, Avery couldn't stop herself from letting out a bitter, mocking sneer at the sheer, disgusting hypocrisy of it all. The group was incredibly forward, showering Avery with blunt compliments about how gorgeous she looked. One man with a heavy French accent even took her hand and pressed a kiss against her knuckles. Avery's cheeks flushed with a soft pink. George held his glass, taking a sip of champagne as his gaze rested gently upon her. It was his first time seeing her in a long dress. The lake blue perfectly complemented her pale skin, and her long hair flowed down softly over her shoulders. As she lowered her head slightly in bashfulness, she looked like an entirely different person from the timid little girl in his memory who was always crying in front of him. It suddenly occurred to him that she was already 21 this year, old enough to have experienced and weathered anything. His mind flashed back to his grandmother's absurd dying wish. His face darkened, and he tore his gaze away from her. Sloane intimately looped her arm through Avery's, asking if she would accompany her upstairs for a moment. If she could have foreseen what was about to happen, Avery would have firmly said no, no matter how difficult it was to decline. When they reached the landing at the top of the second-floor stairs, Sloane suddenly yanked Avery's arm, let out a piercing scream, and threw herself directly backward, tumbling all the way down the steps. Avery felt as if she had been struck by a sledgehammer. Her mind went completely blank. The party immediately erupted into absolute chaos. Avery walked down the stairs in a total daze, pushing her way through the crowd until she reached Sloane's side. She saw the other girl lying on the ground, her head split open and bleeding. Upon seeing Avery, Sloane pointed a trembling finger at her, her voice strained and agonizing as she gasped that if Avery had wanted George as her dance partner, she only needed to say so. She asked Avery why she had pushed her. With those words, Sloane's tears spilled over. The room plunged into a deathly silence in an instant as countless pairs of eyes snapped toward her. Avery's mind spun in sheer shock before the brutal realization finally set in. A cold, cynical smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. Whatever she was about to say was completely drowned out by George shouting to call an ambulance. He scooped Sloane up into his arms. As he carried her away, he turned his head and gave Avery a single look. That gaze was impossibly, devastatingly cold. What should have been a perfect celebratory gala ended in sheer tragedy. Sloane not only suffered a concussion but had also broken her leg, requiring a full month of hospitalization. Avery sat outside the hospital room, her face completely void of expression. When George finally stepped out of the room, she stood up and called his name. He walked right past her without so much as a sideways glance. She walked into the ward. Sloane was awake, her legs suspended in an awkward cast and thick white gauze wrapped heavily around her head. Her face was deathly pale, completely stripped of her usual radiant glamour. But Avery knew full well that seeing her looking this fragile was more than enough to make George's heart ache, and more than enough to guarantee he would believe her. Avery stared at Sloane, and Sloane looked right back up at her. A long moment passed. With a cold sneer, Avery asked if she didn't find using such despicable tricks to be incredibly cheap. Sloane offered a faint smile, replying that while it might be cheap, it was highly effective, wasn't it? She paused for a second before adding that he already hated Avery anyway. She was simply giving him a reason to hate her just a little bit more. Avery gritted her teeth, asking her if she honestly thought she had won. With those words, she turned on her heel and walked out of the room. She sat back down on the chair outside the ward, refusing to leave. An hour later, George returned carrying a change of clothes for Sloane. Avery stood up, blocking his path, and for the very first time, she spoke to him in a voice just as icy as his own. She reminded him of his promise to marry her, asking bluntly if that vow still stood. He finally looked her dead in the eye. Yet his gaze was filled with such bottomless indifference and revulsion that he was staring at her as if she were a total stranger. After a long silence, he sneered, telling her that she truly made him sick. Avery kept her chin raised and actually let out a laugh, declaring that it didn't matter, as long as he married her. Nothing mattered anymore. Absolutely none of it mattered. He didn't believe her anyway. He had never, ever believed her. In his mind, she was just a willful, chaotic, shameless, manipulative curse. She turned and walked away. This time, she was finally the one to walk away first. The instant she turned her back, her tears broke like a shattered dam, entirely drowning out the rest of the world. Caught in that overwhelming flood, her heart was swallowed by an intense, suffocating despair. On Avery's 22nd birthday, she and George registered their marriage in London, signing the papers in a brief, sterile civil ceremony at the registry office. Aside from a pair of plain rings and a single witness, there was absolutely nothing else. No proposal, no flowers, no banquet, no kiss, and no blessings from family. He was marrying her solely because of a promise. It had absolutely nothing to do with love. He had explicitly told her that he would never, ever love her. London was swallowed by a thick, freezing fog that day. Wrapped in a bright red overcoat, Avery stood on the steps of the registry office, watching George's figure slowly vanish into the dense mist. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, feeling the bitter chill. It was the absolute coldest weather she had experienced since arriving in England, and undeniably the coldest day of her entire life. She stood in that heavy fog for a very long time, entirely unsure of which direction she was supposed to go. The city was so unimaginably vast, yet she had no home here. Long before the sun even set that day, she curled up in bed and fell asleep. She was staying in the small apartment he had bought for her. It was his wedding gift to her, yet he had abandoned her to spend their wedding night entirely alone. The phone call woke her at exactly 2:30 in the morning. Every ounce of sleep vanished from her body in an instant. Her hands were shaking so violently as she hung up that the phone slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the floor. She practically tore out of the apartment, hailing a cab and rushing straight to the hospital. Outside the operating room, Sloane was sitting on a bench, her face dark and deadly serious. Avery grabbed her hand, her voice trembling violently as she stammered, asking how he was doing. Sloane violently shook her off, raised her hand, and slapped Avery hard across the face. She screamed that it was all Avery's fault, calling her a literal curse. A man who never set foot in bars had gone out to get blackout drunk tonight. In his drunken state, George had gotten into an altercation that escalated into a physical brawl. He ended up getting stabbed directly in the chest, and the wound was incredibly severe. Avery squeezed her eyes shut, dropping to a crouch and clutching her head as she shook uncontrollably. Right then, a nurse sprinted out of the operating room, frantically announcing that the patient needed a blood transfusion. The hospital's reserve of type A blood was completely depleted. She desperately asked if anyone present, or any of his friends, was a type A match. Avery practically vaulted to her feet, shouting that she was a type A match. She hadn't eaten a single thing all day. As nearly 2 pints of blood were drained from her body, a crushing wave of dizziness crashed over her. Yet she just bit down hard on her lip and didn't even blink. Then began another agonizingly long wait. She and Sloane sat across from one another in complete, unbroken silence. 2 hours later, the operating room doors finally swung open. The surgeon stepped out and announced that the patient was out of danger. Avery let out a massive, shuddering breath and collapsed back onto the floor. Once George was transferred to a recovery ward, Avery tried to follow him in, but Sloane physically blocked her at the door. Sloane asked her point-blank if she honestly believed he would want to see her face when he woke up. Avery insisted that she needed to take care of him. Sloane let out a harsh laugh, telling her that staying the hell away from him was the best possible care she could give him. Avery's hand, which had been raised to push the other girl aside, froze in midair. Slowly, her fingers went slack, and she lowered her arm. Avery found the entire situation utterly laughable. She was his legal, rightful wife, yet here she was, being barred from his hospital room by another woman. She was his wife, yet he had spent their wedding night getting blackout drunk at a bar. He must have been so completely repulsed by her that he couldn't bear to face the reality of their marriage sober, driving him to such extremes. This marriage was nothing but a grotesque, absurd joke. Sloane was right. He absolutely wouldn't want to see her. She turned around. Sloane's voice rang out behind her, adding a final warning. She had better not tell him she had donated the blood. Sloane pointed out that since he despised her so deeply, if he ever found out that her blood was coursing through his veins. Avery offered a numb nod. She had no idea how she managed to force her legs to carry her away. By the time she reached the hospital entrance, her body simply gave out, and she collapsed in a dead faint right onto the floor. Sloane stood beside the hospital bed, staring down at a deeply unconscious George. His face was completely drained of color, His lips pressed into a tight line, and his thick brows were drawn together. Even deep in sleep, he seemed completely weighed down by an immense, inescapable misery. Sloane murmured softly, asking him if he loved Avery. She let out a bitter, self-deprecating smile. She had known he loved the girl for a very long time. Years ago, solely to protect Avery, he had actually agreed to study abroad in England with her. Later on, when Avery ended up hospitalized and he was constantly flying all over the world to get their new gallery off the ground, he had specifically asked Sloane to look after her, requesting that Sloane take the girl out for meals and tea. He had been using her as a covert pipeline to keep tabs on Avery's life all along. What an impossibly twisted, stubborn man, she scoffed to herself. He was so obviously in love with her, yet because of those two absurd dying wishes, he harbored a furious resentment toward her, violently forcing himself to push her away. If he truly despised and hated her, how could he possibly go through with marrying her just for the sake of a promise? If it wasn't out of love, why would he be in such excruciating agony that he had to get blackout drunk at a bar on his own wedding night? Love completely blinded a person, and hate did the exact same thing. George's profound torment stemmed entirely from the fact that he undeniably loved her. Yet his massive ego and stubbornness had continuously brainwashed him into believing he despised and loathed her. He had maintained that delusion for 10 solid years, successfully lying even to himself. Sloane thought back to the words Avery had thrown at her, asking if she thought she had won. No. Sloane had always known with crystal clarity that she had never won a single thing. She hadn't even earned the right to step onto their battlefield. In that exhausting, decade-long war, it had always only ever been about him and her. The only tragedy was that both of them had lost. The very last time Avery saw George was on the day their marriage reached the 1-month mark. She remembered it was a rare clear day in February. The London winter sun was thin, yet it cast real warmth onto the pavement. He was recovering from his injuries at home, having already moved into a much more spacious apartment. When Avery knocked and the door opened, he looked at her, entirely stunned for a brief moment. He had not laid eyes on her since the day of their wedding. She looked up at him with a smile, holding up the grocery bags in her hands to announce that she was making dinner for him. That day, she had been bustling around the kitchen since 3 in the afternoon, bringing out dish after dish until the entire dining table was packed to the brim. Sitting at the table, George looked at the massive spread of food, wondering to himself just how many dishes she had actually cooked. Avery stood still by the dining table, gazing at every single dish. Her voice was incredibly soft, as if she were carefully counting through her memories, and she slowly read them off one by one. Braised beef ribs, rosemary roasted chicken, stir-fried beef with zucchini, pork stewed with apples, pan-seared salmon, garlic broccoli, honey-glazed carrots, and buttered mashed potatoes. She recited every single one. Sitting there and listening to the names of the dishes, George gradually felt certain words rise to the back of his throat, but he swallowed them down and said nothing. These were, in every absolute sense, her memories. He would never, ever know that these specific dishes were the exact lunches she had cooked for him all those years ago. Every single one of them. George looked at her, thinking that she was acting incredibly strange today. After counting off the very last dish, Avery finally told him it was time to eat. They ate that meal in total, drawn-out silence. George tasted a little bit of everything. Perhaps it was simply because it had been so long since he had eaten a home-cooked meal, but he found the food to be unbelievably delicious. It suddenly dawned on him that this was actually the very first time he had ever eaten her cooking. He remembered how, many years ago, she had tirelessly delivered a lunchbox to him every single noon, and he had never taken a single bite. In the blink of an eye, a full decade had rushed past. In the end, there was a lot of food left over. Avery dumped absolutely all of it straight into the trash can. She moved so fast that George didn't even have time to stop her. He stared in deep frustration as the delicious food instantly turned into garbage, shooting Avery a sharp glare and muttering that it was a waste. Avery stared down at the trash can and replied that leftover food was exactly like affection that had nowhere to go. She turned and walked into the kitchen to wash the dishes, leaving him standing by the trash can in a complete daze. By the time she left, it was 8:15 in the evening. He stood at the door watching her go, wanting to say something, but ultimately keeping his mouth shut. Stepping outside the door, she suddenly stopped, turned around, and looked at him. She called out his name, using a tone he had not heard in a very, very long time. It was incredibly soft and intensely careful, exactly like the 12-year-old version of herself standing outside the window and looking at him, as if speaking his name too heavily would shatter it into pieces. He froze in place. She asked him if he could possibly just smile at her. He let out a confused hum, truly feeling that she was acting bizarrely tonight. He furrowed his brow, but before he could even open his mouth, she cut him off again. "Goodbye," she said. In the exact moment she turned around, he thought he saw a thick mist welling up in her eyes, though perhaps it was just a hallucination, considering she had been offering him a faint smile while saying goodbye just a second earlier. She walked out of the light and straight into the shadows, her figure slowly disappearing from his line of sight. He heard the clear ding of the elevator arriving, and for some inexplicable reason, it felt as if something had just chimed exactly like that deep within his own chest. It felt as though, in the casual motion of shutting his front door, he had permanently locked something out. 3 days later, George received an envelope. Upon tearing it open, he was struck completely motionless. It was a signed divorce agreement. Her signature sat at the very bottom, the handwriting impeccably clean, every stroke deliberate and utterly devoid of a single trace of hesitation. He stared down at that document for a very long time. He grabbed his phone and dialed her number, only to have the automated voice repeat over and over again that the number he had dialed was no longer in service. Clutching the document, he sat on the sofa in a completely blank daze until the sky outside turned pitch black. His vacant stare remained rigidly fixed on the signature at the very end of the page. Avery. Swallowed in the darkness, a single voice echoed endlessly through his mind, repeating that she was gone. She was gone. She was entirely gone. She had finally done exactly what he wanted and walked out of his life. But if that were true, why did his chest feel so devastatingly hollow and entirely empty? Amidst the deafening roar of the airplane engines, Avery closed her eyes, thinking quietly to herself that he must have certainly received the agreement by now. She figured he must have let out a massive sigh of relief, finally completely free of her. She reached out and gently traced the finger on her right hand, where a simple platinum band still sat. It was supposed to have been mailed to him right along with the divorce papers, but in the absolute end, she simply couldn't bear to part with it. It was the one and only gift he had given her in an entire decade. Right up until the very last possible second, she had still harbored a desperate, lingering hope, telling herself that if he just smiled at her, she would stay. She would stay right by his side, no matter how much he hated or despised her. But ultimately, he hadn't offered her a single smile. He probably had no idea that in the full 10 years they had known each other, he had never, not even once, shown her a smile. Never. Only when someone harbored a genuine, extreme revulsion toward another person could they be so utterly stingy as to withhold even a single, simple smile. Perhaps this was for the best. She could finally harden her resolve and quietly walk away. Goodbye, George. Goodbye.
Epilogue. Inside an airport coffee shop, just as I finished my second cup of coffee, someone walked up right beside me. A cold, clear male voice rang out from above my head, asking if I was Jess. I stood up and looked at the man. It took only one single glance for me to know exactly who he was. George. The George from Avery's story. He was an incredibly handsome man, but his expression was entirely frigid. Likely due to taking a long red-eye flight, he looked completely exhausted, with faint, dark circles beneath his eyes. I nodded, confirming that yes, I was Jess Wilson. He sat down directly across from me and immediately demanded to know if I had news about Avery, asking where she was. His face remained entirely composed, yet I could clearly hear the desperate urgency laced through his tone. I lowered my head, pulled 2 cloth bags out of my purse, one large, one small, and set them directly onto the table. I told him quietly that she was right here. He furrowed his brow, asking what I meant. I repeated myself, telling him that Avery was right here. I untied the large cloth bag, revealing a small wooden urn. He stared at me in total confusion, uttering a questioning word, before the brutal realization finally crashed into him, violently contorting his face. I don't know exactly how to describe the look on his face in that split second. The phrase ashen and completely shattered was probably the only accurate description. A very long time passed. With violently shaking fingers, he slowly reached out to touch the urn, only to flinch and pull his hand back in midair. He squeezed his eyes shut, reached out again, and impossibly slowly pulled the urn into the palms of his hands. He clutched the urn tight to his chest, his voice trembling slightly as he asked if she had left any final words. I quietly told him that she wanted her ashes buried in the apple orchard. I then pushed the smaller cloth bag across the table toward him, explaining that it was the absolute only possession she had left behind. Inside the bag was her wedding ring. In the absolute end, it had been returned to him anyway. George and I flew back together to the small town where he and Avery used to live. I had promised Avery that I would bring her back to that orchard. In truth, there was one more sentence to Avery's final wishes. She had explicitly told me not to tell George. That was the one promise I completely refused to keep. I had dug George's phone number out of her cell phone. It was the absolute only number saved in her entire contacts list, and the name attached to it was simply mine. During the flight, which lasted over an hour, George and I sat side by side in unbroken silence. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, clutching Avery's urn desperately tightly against his chest. It was my very first time visiting this small town, yet it didn't feel foreign to me at all. Perhaps I had simply visited it countless times through Avery's stories. I finally laid eyes on the apple orchard from her tales. Clusters of pristine white apple blossoms hung heavily from the branches. The rose-colored sunset on the horizon washed over them, making the flowers look unimaginably tender and devastatingly sorrowful. As the spring breeze swept through, the pure white petals drifted to the ground in a rustling shower. I knew perfectly well that those falling petals were saying a final goodbye to Avery. I stood beneath a tree, watching George from a distance. He was crouched beneath the most beautiful apple tree in the entire orchard, using his bare hands to dig away the soil inch by inch. His movements were incredibly, painfully slow, as if he intended to keep digging until the end of time. Finally, with his own hands, he buried her in the very soil she had loved so deeply. Buried right alongside her were two rings, hers and his, their wedding bands. My mind flashed back to the conversation I had with him just 5 minutes earlier. I had asked him point blank if he had ever actually loved her. He replied that she had told me a story about herself, and that he had a story about himself too, but his story was only a single sentence long. I asked him what it was. His voice sounded almost like a fevered hallucination as he confessed that he had absolutely no idea when the love had started. He only knew that it had never, ever stopped. My heart twisted in sheer agony, leaving me completely speechless for a very long time. It was entirely because of that single sentence that I ultimately chose to tell him the secret Avery had buried in the orchard all those years ago. George had frozen, and then he immediately began tearing at the earth. He moved from the base of one apple tree to the next. His fingers gradually tore open and began to bleed, yet he dug and dug with completely tireless desperation, as if he couldn't feel the agonizing pain at all. He was desperately trying to unearth the letters she had buried there years ago, the secret devotions that were entirely about him. But even as the sunset completely faded, as night fully crashed down and the sky turned pitch black, he didn't find a single scrap of paper. Watching him from afar, I squeezed my eyes shut. Too late. Absolutely everything was far too late. Those secret devotions, carrying the absolute heaviest, most profound love of a young girl, had long since been rotted away by the wind and rain of the passing years. It was exactly like the man kneeling right now amidst the scent of the apple blossoms, his shoulders violently shaking. He had woken up to the truth of his own heart far, far too late. Avery had said that the absolute most devastating part was that he had never once smiled at her. And now here he was, violently weeping for her. But absolutely everything was just too late. He loved her, yet to the very end of her life she had never known.